The lawyer's office felt smaller than I remembered, almost suffocating, as though the walls themselves were closing in with the weight of expectation. The faint scent of polished wood and old paper clung to my nostrils, mingling with the subtle perfume someone had worn that morning, creating an almost dizzying cocktail of memories and unease. I sat stiffly in a leather chair, my spine rigid, hands clasped so tightly that my knuckles had turned white. Around me, distant relatives whispered in hushed tones, their words a mixture of curiosity, polite sympathy, and something darker, something like anticipation for the moment that would shatter our shared illusion of normalcy. The soft hum of the air conditioning, the occasional creak of the floorboards, even the muffled sound of rain tapping against the windows, all seemed unnaturally amplified. Each tick of the antique clock on the wall was a drumbeat counting down to a revelation I wasn't ready for. I tried to steady my breath, to appear composed, but my chest felt tight, my thoughts spinning. I caught my reflection in the polished surface of the conference table, a woman poised, composed, but with eyes betraying the storm brewing inside. Were they all here to see me crumble? I couldn't tell, and the uncertainty gnawed at me like a persistent shadow. The lawyer cleared his throat, a dry, crisp sound that sliced through the tension, making everyone pause. I could feel the gaze of each person in the room, probing, expectant, calculating, and pressed against me like a physical force. The rain outside grew heavier, each drop hammering against the window in rhythmic insistence, echoing the rhythm of my heart. I wanted to turn away, to flee into the gray drizzle outside, but my hands remained clenched, my mind trapped between fear and a dreadful curiosity. The envelope in the lawyer's hands seemed suddenly enormous, heavy with the weight of all the years we had shared. The lawyer unfolded the document carefully, his fingers brushing over the paper as though he too sensed the gravity of what he was about to reveal. "For my true love," he said, his voice measured, deliberate, echoing faintly off the polished walls. The words floated in the air, seemingly light, but carrying the weight of 100 unspoken truths, a dagger wrapped in velvet. I froze mid-breath, my chest tightening so sharply that I feared I might choke on the air itself. My mind raced, replaying decades of mornings, nights, whispered promises, the small sacrifices I had thought he noticed. As the lawyer continued, the rest of the will spilling out in monotone, I realized my name was absent. Not mentioned once, not a single acknowledgement of my presence, my life intertwined with his for 20 years. A shiver ran down my spine, icy and deep, as if the room had suddenly lost its temperature. I blinked rapidly, trying to force reality into focus. Was this a mistake? I searched his familiar handwriting in my mind, trying to reconcile this with the man I thought I knew, but nothing aligned. Every memory, every smile, every late-night conversation suddenly seemed like a carefully arranged illusion. The words of the lawyer became a thunderous echo inside my skull, relentless and unyielding, each one carving a deeper hollow of doubt and dread. The air in the room thickened, as if the walls themselves were pressing in, absorbing the shock and amplifying it back tenfold. Gasps erupted, soft whispers became hurried murmurs, and the shuffle of feet across the polished floor created a staccato of unease. I felt detached, floating above my own body, watching the scene unfold in slow motion. Faces turned toward me, but their expressions were unreadable, some sympathetic, some calculating, all expectant. My heartbeat thundered in my ears, drowning out the lawyer's voice, as if trying to warn me that the world I had known was no longer solid. My hands trembled violently now, though I tried to cover them with the lap of my dress. My legs felt rooted to the floor, yet a strange pull urged me forward to confrontation, to answers I wasn't sure I wanted. Had my life with him been a lie? The thought clawed at me, a dark seed that refused to be ignored. The envelope, once a simple piece of paper, now seemed a portal to a hidden world, a Pandora's box of secrets I wasn't prepared for. The lawyer's voice faded into the background, a dull monotone as my mind spiraled into the questions. Who was this true love? Why was I left out? What had I never known about the man I shared my life with? A sudden, almost imperceptible draft swept through the room, stirring the papers on the table, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. Something had shifted, not in the world, but inside me. Curiosity, sharp and dangerous, began to edge out the shock, whispering that I couldn't leave this room without uncovering the truth. And in that moment, I understood this was only the beginning. Something terrible, or perhaps revealing, awaited, and I could not turn away. The drive home was quiet, the city streets slick with rain, reflecting the gray, oppressive sky above. My fingers drummed nervously against the steering wheel, but my mind was far away, trapped in the lawyer's office and the words that had shattered my world. The house, once a sanctuary, loomed ahead like a monument to memory and silence. The garden, perfectly trimmed, seemed almost mocking in its orderliness, a stark contrast to the chaos storming inside me. As I inserted the key and stepped through the familiar door, the smell of polished wood and old furniture greeted me like a hollow echo. Everything was as it had always been, yet unrecognizable, the rooms vast and quiet, the shadows long and accusing. The photographs on the walls, smiling faces frozen in time, now seemed to whisper questions. Who was he really? Was I ever truly seen? Each footstep on the hardwood floor sounded impossibly loud, a hollow reminder of solitude. The echoes of laughter, of whispered conversations from years past, felt distant, almost phantom-like. I wandered from room to room, letting my eyes rest on small details. The coffee cup he had always left by the armchair, the scarf draped carelessly over the banister, all familiar, all untouched, yet now meaningless. I touched the surfaces, ran my hand along the spines of books, the edge of tables, hoping for a connection, for some proof that my life with him had mattered. But instead, the emptiness grew heavier with each step, pressing against my chest, stealing my breath. Had I really known him at all? The thought lingered like a shadow, crawling through the edges of my mind. I stopped in front of the family portraits lining the hallway. Each frame caught a moment of joy, a frozen memory of what I had always believed was love and shared life. Yet now, they seemed to mock me. The smiles, the laughter, even the way he had held my hand in some pictures, everything felt staged in retrospect, like pieces of a puzzle where the most important piece had always been missing. I leaned closer, tracing the contours of his face with my eyes, searching for signs I had overlooked, hoping for a hint of truth hidden in the shadows of those smiles. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner sounded louder than ever, each second hammering home the realization that the man I had married had a private life, a hidden story I wasn't allowed to see. I walked to the mantel, where small trinkets and souvenirs from vacations we had taken together rested. Even these, so intimate at the time, now felt like artifacts from a stranger's life. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window panes, and I shivered, as though the house itself were reminding me of the emptiness within. What did he hide from me? Who had been standing in these rooms when I thought I was the only one he loved? The questions spun faster and faster, refusing to slow down. I sank into the armchair by the fireplace, the leather stiff and cold beneath me. My mind replayed memories I had long dismissed, the evenings he claimed to be at work but returned later than expected, the secretive phone calls he had answered in another room, the subtle avoidance of certain topics whenever I asked. At the time, I had brushed them aside, calling them quirks, ignoring the uneasy pit in my stomach. Now, every small detail seemed to scream betrayal. The gentle creak of the staircase above, the whisper of wind outside, and the faint ticking of the clock became a symphony of questions, each one echoing louder than the last. I clutched a photo of us on our wedding day, trying to summon the warmth that once brought. Instead, I felt a hollow ache, the slow realization that love, or at least the love I thought we shared, could exist alongside secrets, shadows, and grief. The house, with all its familiar corners, now felt alien, a labyrinth of memories that no longer offered comfort but torment. I could almost hear him in the silence, murmuring apologies I would never hear, footsteps I would never feel behind me again. If he had a true love, who was she? And why had I been left in the dark all these years? The questions burned, unrelenting, and I knew that answers would not come from the comfort of this empty home. I would have to find them, even if they led me into darkness. The house was eerily quiet, each tick of the old wall clock sounding like a drumbeat in my chest. Dust floated in beams of sunlight streaming through the blinds, shimmering like tiny golden motes, and yet the warmth of the morning felt cold against my skin. I wandered through the study, where his desk sat like a shrine, perfectly organized, untouched, almost expecting him to return at any moment and claim it as his own. My fingers hovered over stacks of unopened letters and envelopes, hesitant to disturb anything, as if the act itself might shatter reality. Then, beneath a stack of mundane bills and notes, I noticed a small envelope, slightly yellowed with age, addressed in his familiar handwriting, precise, deliberate, but signed with only a single initial, A. A chill ran down my spine, crawling like icy fingers over my neck. I hesitated, tracing the letter with trembling hands, the paper whispering softly against my fingertips as I unfolded it. The cinderbold ink hit me, faint, floral, and oddly intimate, stirring memories I had long buried. My eyes darted around the room, half expecting someone to appear, to challenge me for looking. I read the first line, and my heart lurched. The words were tender, personal, almost intimate, as though written for someone I had never been. Every letter, every phrase was a stroke of his hidden life, a confession I was never meant to see. My pulse hammered, echoing against the walls. Who was A? I barely breathed, the question catching like smoke in my throat. I unfolded the paper completely and scanned it again, slowly, deliberately. The handwriting was unmistakably his, the loops and curls of the letters, the occasional pressure smudge, yet the words weren't meant for me. They were soft, affectionate, and shockingly familiar in tone, speaking of shared moments, secret jokes, and dreams whispered in privacy. My chest tightened, the air around me feeling heavier with every line I read, each word a tiny dagger of betrayal. Shadows seemed to stretch across the room as though the walls themselves were leaning in to witness my discovery. The ink smudges hinted at trembling hands or tears, proof that the emotions here were raw, real, and unseen by me. The intimacy in the letter made my stomach churn. The tenderness was something I had never shared with him, not once in all the years we were married. A low creak from the staircase made me jump. Wind, settling house, or a phantom of my imagination? My mind raced through every moment we'd shared, searching desperately for a clue, a memory, that could explain this letter, and found nothing. Had I ever truly known him? Or had I only imagined what our marriage was? The question hovered, cold and insistent, as if the house itself had become a confessor of his hidden life. Hands trembling, I placed the letter back in its envelope, but the feeling of dread didn't leave me. It had rooted itself in my chest like a stone. The familiar study suddenly felt alien, every book spine and photograph a reminder that I might have been living beside a stranger. I rifled through more drawers, pulling out receipts, small notebooks, and papers, searching for something, anything, to explain the presence of A. Each item I uncovered raised more questions, small payments to a mysterious address, fleeting notes that hinted at clandestine meetings, cryptic comments scribbled in the margins of books. My pulse throbbed violently, and the house seemed to lean inward, shadows pooling in corners as though warning me to stop. A sudden thump from upstairs made me freeze, breath hitching, ear straining. The wind rattled the windows, the old hinges groaned like a slow exhale, and the faint creak of a floorboard reminded me that this house, once comforting, was now filled with ghosts of secrets. I clutched the envelope tighter, the paper cutting lightly into my palm, anchoring me to the reality I wasn't ready to face. Why would he hide this? Who is A? And why does it feel as though I've stumbled into a life I never belonged to? The question circled my mind relentlessly, impossible to escape. And as I looked around the room, shadows stretching like long, accusing fingers, I realized the journey had begun, a path toward a truth more haunting than grief itself. They say death brings peace, but sometimes it brings the loudest, most deafening silence. I sat there in that cold, sterile lawyer's office, the hum of the fluorescent lights above almost painful, my hands resting on the polished mahogany table, fingers trembling despite the steadiness I tried to summon. My heart felt like it had settled into a strange, quiet rhythm, calm, yet heavy, as if bracing for a blow I couldn't yet see. And then, the paper slid across the table toward me, crisp, official, and those 4 words caught me like a dagger. For my true love. I blinked, trying to steady myself. That phrase, that promise, that declaration, that was supposed to be mine. Me. His wife. The one he had whispered promises to on rainy nights, the one he had held through laughter and tears, the one who had shared decades of dreams, fears, and quiet companionship. But as my eyes traced the remainder of the document, my name wasn't there. Not even a mention. The air shifted instantly. The faint scent of polished leather and ink now seemed suffocating, heavy with unspoken judgment and unasked questions. Everyone in the room, the lawyer, the assistant, avoided my gaze. The rustle of paper sounded impossibly loud, punctuating the moment like a cruel drumbeat. And in that moment, 20 years of shared life and assumed intimacy felt fragile, almost imaginary. For the first time in all those years, I questioned everything. Did I ever truly know the man I had married? Was I the love of his life, the one he held closest, or just a chapter, a convenient story he intended to forget when the ink dried on new promises? My stomach twisted, but strangely, grief didn't come. Instead, a sharp, dangerous curiosity began to quell inside me, tightening with each passing second. What had he hidden? What stories, what decisions, what truths had I been blind to while thinking I knew everything? Because love may die, but secrets never do. They linger, like shadows in a sunlit room, quietly watching, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And this moment, I realized, had finally arrived. But before I continue, make sure you're subscribed to the Old Folks channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. We love to see how far our stories travel, and this one isn't finished yet. The night was thick and silent, but inside my mind, a storm raged like a hurricane. The house felt different now, colder, heavier, as if the walls themselves were watching me, holding their breath while I uncovered truths they had witnessed all along. I switched on the desk lamp, the harsh glow cutting through the shadows and illuminating decades of life, old letters stacked in neat piles, receipts carefully tucked into drawers, and envelopes that seemed to whisper secrets. My hands trembled, but I couldn't stop. Every paper I opened, every note I unfolded, felt like a breadcrumb left deliberately, yet hidden from me for years. The letter signed with a single initial, A, burned in my memory, urging me forward. I began sifting through the envelopes one by one, discovering small payments, always the same amount, always monthly, always sent to an address I had never known existed. My heart pounded, a relentless drumbeat echoing in the silent house. I whispered to myself, why hide this? Why me? Who is she? The rain outside began to tap harder against the windows, each droplet like a heartbeat, matching the rhythm of my rising dread. Hours passed without me noticing. The digital glow of my laptop illuminated my face in the darkness as I traced emails, phone logs, and bank records. Each new discovery felt like stepping into a shadowed hallway, where every door might conceal something I was not ready to see. Tiny transfers, regular as clockwork, connected to a quiet part of town, a street lined with modest brick apartments, trees that swayed in the wind like silent sentinels. My pulse quickened as I realized the meticulous care he had taken to hide this life from me, right under my nose. I began to notice subtle patterns, notes tucked into files, references to dates and small gestures of affection that were not meant for me. The very fabric of my memories began to unravel. The love I thought had been ours, shared, mutual, now seemed like a delicate illusion, a carefully crafted mask hiding a parallel existence. Outside, a car engine rumbled past, startling me. Every creak of the old house, every shadow cast by the flickering streetlights, seemed magnified in the oppressive silence. Was he hiding her, protecting her, or hiding me from her? And why did it feel as if the entire truth hovered just out of reach, waiting for me to step closer, or stumble? By the time dawn bled pale light across the room, exhaustion had merged with obsession. I could not stop, even if I wanted to. Every note, every bank slip, every whisper of evidence drew me deeper into a labyrinth I hadn't asked to enter. I traced transactions, emails, and letters with a meticulous hand, cross-referencing dates, amounts, and addresses. Every small clue felt like a heartbeat, guiding me toward a life I had never seen, a love I had never shared. The initial A echoed in my mind, like a ghost murmuring secrets to the walls. The air around me felt thick, charged, almost electric. The quiet hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, the distant rumble of a train, every sound amplified, every shadow stretching like a hand reaching toward me. I whispered his name, trembling, imagining the hidden life he had lived while I remained unaware, raising our children, keeping the house, giving him decades of devotion. The house seemed to respond, groaning as though in warning, bending the silence around me. And then I made a decision, a choice fueled by curiosity, anger, and a need for truth. I would find that address. I would confront the life he had kept secret. As I grabbed my coat and keys, the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to shift, dark and expectant. I didn't know if I was walking toward closure, or a nightmare I could never escape. The address led me to a quiet street, lined with aging brick buildings, their facades darkened by years of rain and soot. The air smelled faintly of damp concrete and decaying leaves, a chill crawling over my skin. I stood before a small, neat apartment door, the kind that could have belonged to anyone, except that the mailbox bore my husband's name. My heart thudded like a drum as I hesitated, hand hovering over the brass doorknob. The building seemed alive, breathing with secrets, its narrow hallways whispering under the weight of shadows. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges groaning in protest, and stepped inside. The apartment was immaculately kept, the furniture minimal but carefully arranged. A faint scent of his cologne lingered, haunting and intimate, as though he had only just left. On the walls, photographs, dozens of them, were arranged with deliberate precision, each frame holding a frozen moment. And then I noticed, the faces weren't mine. I moved closer, my eyes scanning every frame, every detail. The photographs were of a young woman, her hair cascading in waves, eyes bright and alive, her smile radiant in every shot. There she was on holidays, by the seaside, in the park, and in every image, he stood beside her, his arm draped protectively over her shoulder. My fingers trembled as I touched a photo, half expecting it to dissolve into smoke. The apartment was silent, yet I felt a presence, a memory etched into every corner. Drawers contained letters, carefully stacked, with handwriting so delicate it felt like it was pressed straight from the heart. And in one drawer, I found small keepsakes, dried flowers, a locket, a faded scarf, tangible proof that she had existed, that she had mattered. My breath caught in my throat as I whispered his name. Who was she? And why had he hidden this life so completely from me, from our home, from everything we shared? The more I explored, the heavier the air became, thick with grief and love and secrets that had been preserved like relics. Each step echoed in the tiny apartment, bouncing off the walls, reminding me of the absence that had always lingered in our marriage, the quiet distance I had once chalked up to fatigue or distraction. But now, in this cramped, perfect space, I understood that absence had a name. I sank onto the couch, running my hands over the letters, the photographs, the mementos, as though by touching them, I could reach across the veil of years to understand him. Outside, the city moved on, indifferent to the story unfolding in this quiet apartment. I could feel the pull of the past, the weight of unspoken love pressing down on me, almost suffocating. And then, buried beneath a pile of letters, I found a small notebook with a single phrase scrawled in bold, deliberate handwriting, "For my true love." My heart froze. Was this what the will had meant? Or was there something even deeper, darker, more heartbreaking yet to come? The building was tucked away on a quiet street, almost hidden from view, its brick facade darkened by years of rain and soot. I paused outside, staring at the small apartment window, wondering what truth awaited me inside. Pushing the door open, the scent of old paper, faint perfume, and polished wood hit me like a wave, an invisible memory lingering in the air. Each step on the worn carpet echoed softly, like whispers from a past I had never lived. On the coffee table, letters and photographs were arranged with obsessive precision, almost like a shrine. My hands trembled as I picked up the first letter, the paper delicate, edges curling with age. The words inside were intimate, filled with longing and affection, yet dated from a time before I had even met him. My chest tightened, decades of what I thought I knew about my husband were colliding with a secret life, one he had carried silently, even in the midst of our marriage. The apartment seemed alive, every corner whispering the name of a woman who had been gone for years. And then, I realized, the words in the will, "For my true love," weren't meant for me, but for someone he had never stopped loving. I sank into the couch, clutching the letters as if they could give me both answers and closure. Each envelope revealed moments of tenderness and sorrow, written with care, the handwriting fluid, elegant, alive. I read the dates carefully. Some letters predated our marriage, others overlapped it, sending chills down my spine. He had never forgotten her, never truly let her go. The realization struck me harder than grief itself. He had loved deeply, painfully, and with a devotion that death had not broken. I could almost hear his voice, soft and trembling, whispering apologies across the empty rooms. It was as if the apartment itself held her presence, every photograph, every letter, every small trinket a testament to a love that refused to die. I ran my fingers over a photograph of her smiling face, the eyes seeming to follow me, and a cold shiver ran down my spine. Could it be possible that he had lived a double life, not in betrayal, but in silent mourning? And as I stared into the photo, the first question struck me with unbearable clarity. Had he loved me at all, or had I been a consolation in the shadow of his grief? The evening light dimmed, casting long, fractured shadows across the room. I stood near the window, clutching the letters and photographs to my chest, feeling as if the walls themselves were watching, holding their breath. A faint breeze rustled through the partially open window, carrying with it the scent of wet asphalt and distant rain, as though the city outside mourned with me. My eyes fell on the small wooden desk in the corner, a journal partially hidden under stacks of photographs. My heart pounded with anticipation, fear, and awe. Could I read it? Would it explain the man I thought I knew, or shatter what remained of my trust? The phrase "for my true love" now hung over me like a specter, heavy, unyielding, and yet full of sorrow. It was not a message of betrayal, but a testament to a grief he carried silently, a devotion preserved beyond death, untouchable and eternal. I whispered her name aloud, and the echo lingered in the small apartment like a ghostly presence, asking me, could I ever forgive a man for loving someone before me so completely, and yet still loving me in the life we shared? The apartment was a shrine to absence. The air was heavy with the faint scent of old paper and lavender, and the dim glow from a flickering street lamp outside painted the walls in trembling streaks of light and shadow. I moved slowly, each step echoing faintly on the creaking wooden floor, as if the apartment itself held its breath. On the far side of the room, partially hidden beneath a pile of yellowed photographs and unopened letters, lay a small, leather-bound journal, its spine cracked and worn from years of secrecy. My fingers hovered for a moment before touching it, hesitant, almost reverent. When I opened the cover, the faint rustle of pages sounded like whispered confessions, intimate and haunting. Words written in a looping, deliberate hand filled each page, revealing a life that existed alongside, and yet entirely separate from, the life I thought I shared with him. A candle on the nightstand flickered, casting trembling shadows across the walls, and I could feel the apartment leaning in closer, the silence thick with anticipation. Who was he in these words, and why had I never seen this side of him before? The journal was a revelation, each entry a dagger wrapped in silk. His words spoke of nights spent alone, of grief so consuming that it seemed to warp the air itself. He wrote of a woman, delicate, radiant, untouchable, whose memory had shadowed his every decision. He confessed guilt, regret, and longing in paragraphs so raw that I could hear his voice trembling through the paper, like a distant echo calling across time. He wrote of promises made in silence, of love that persisted despite circumstance, and of sorrow he carried like a weight heavier than life itself. My chest tightened as I read, the edges of reality blurring, the apartment shrinking around me with the weight of his emotions. And then I reached a passage that made my hands freeze. She never left me. I just stopped seeing her. The words struck like lightning, illuminating the darkness of my assumptions. It was not betrayal, not exactly. It was devotion misplaced, hidden, and preserved in the quietest corners of his soul. My mind raced. All these years, I had thought I knew him, had thought I was enough, but he had carried this other love, invisible, sacred, untouchable. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized the depths of his heart, a place I had never been allowed to enter. Could one person truly love so deeply for another who was gone? Could grief itself sustain a kind of fidelity I would never understand? I sank to the floor, journal in my lap, the room dark around me except for the dim stripes of streetlight. The shadows stretched like reaching hands, cold and silent witnesses to my discovery. I traced the looping handwriting with trembling fingers, feeling the intimacy of a man who had lived a secret life beside me. A gust of wind rattled the window pane, and I flinched as though the apartment itself had exhaled. The phrase "for my true love" echoed in my mind now, not as accusation, but as a declaration of eternal grief and devotion. My heart battered in my chest, a mixture of heartbreak, awe, and a strange, almost guilty compassion. Here was a man who had loved beyond memory, beyond reason, beyond even the bounds of what I thought we shared. For a long time, I simply stared out the window, journal in hand, watching the city lights blur in the rain, and whispered to the empty apartment, could anyone love this much and remain silent? The question hung in the air, unanswered, heavy with grief and revelation, as the night deepened and the shadows thickened around me. And yet, for the first time, I felt closer to him than I ever had in life, closer to his truth, raw and fragile, than I had been to his presence. The rain had turned the city into a blur of lights and shadows, each drop streaking the window like tears I hadn't yet allowed myself to shed. I sat on the edge of the armchair, the journal heavy in my lap, its pages thick with words that made my chest tighten. Each line felt like a secret being pulled from the grave, each sentence a pulse of his hidden life. Outside, the wind howled through narrow alleys and empty streets, rattling window panes and whispering through the trees, as though nature itself sensed the grief I carried. My fingers traced the words, reading and rereading, trying to make sense of a love I had never touched but had existed beside me for decades. I realized the phrase "for my true love" wasn't meant to humiliate me, it was meant to preserve a memory, a devotion he had never been able to release. But the truth cut deep, sharper than any betrayal, because it revealed a part of him I had never seen, a life I had never shared. Could someone you loved truly exist in parallel to your own life, and yet remain invisible? Hours passed, and the apartment felt smaller, the walls closing in as shadows stretched across the floor like dark fingers. My heart battered in my chest, but the pain was no longer raw anger, it was a complicated sorrow, a mixture of grief and empathy. I thought of him as a young man, hopeful and lost, encountering a love he could never reclaim. I imagined the conversations, the laughter, the promises whispered to someone who was gone long before our paths crossed. His eyes, at times distant when he looked at me, finally made sense, they had been carrying a ghost all these years. I whispered to the empty room, he loved her, and yet he lived with me. The journal trembled under my hand, as though aware of the emotions it had unleashed. And in that moment, I realized that love is never simple, it is messy, incomplete, and sometimes hidden in shadows we can only discover when it's too late to ask the questions aloud. By the first light of dawn, the city outside slowly stirred to life, muted gold spilling over the rooftops, illuminating the apartment in fragile warmth. I hadn't moved, the journal still open, its words now etched into my memory. The sadness that had gripped me all night began to soften into something unexpected, compassion. I understood the weight he had carried, the grief he had never voiced, the life he had tried to reconcile with love that could never fully exist. I placed a hand over the journal, closing it gently, feeling its weight like a heartbeat, steady, enduring, and honest in ways he could never express aloud. He loved deeply, I whispered, my voice barely audible, trembling like a fragile leaf in the morning breeze. Maybe that's all any of us want, to love and be loved, even if the world never knows the whole story. Outside, a bird called, breaking the silence, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a quiet peace seep into my chest. I knew what I had to do next. I needed to face the past fully, to confront the living memory of someone who had shaped my husband's soul, and finally, my own. The rain had turned the city into a blur of lights and shadows, each drop streaking the window like tears I hadn't yet allowed myself to shed. I sat on the edge of the armchair, the journal heavy in my lap, its pages thick with words that made my chest tighten. Each line felt like a secret being pulled from the grave, each sentence a pulse of his hidden life. Outside, the wind howled through narrow alleys and empty streets, rattling window panes and whispering through the trees, as though nature itself sensed the grief I carried. My fingers traced the words, reading and rereading, trying to make sense of a love I had never touched but had existed beside me for decades. I realized the phrase "for my true love" wasn't meant to humiliate me, it was meant to preserve a memory, a devotion he had never been able to release. But the truth cut deep, sharper than any betrayal, because it revealed a part of him I had never seen, a life I had never shared. Could someone you loved truly exist in parallel to your own life, and yet remain invisible? Hours passed, and the apartment felt smaller, the walls closing in as shadows stretched across the floor like dark fingers. My heart thudded in my chest, but the pain was no longer raw anger. It was a complicated sorrow, a mixture of grief and empathy. I thought of him as a young man, hopeful and lost, encountering a love he could never reclaim. I imagined the conversations, the laughter, the promises whispered to someone who was gone long before our paths crossed. His eyes, at times distant when he looked at me, finally made sense. They had been carrying a ghost all these years. I whispered to the empty room, he loved her, and yet he lived with me. The journal trembled under my hand, as though aware of the emotions it had unleashed. And in that moment, I realized that love is never simple. It is messy, incomplete, and sometimes hidden in shadows we can only discover when it's too late to ask the questions aloud. By the first light of dawn, the city outside slowly stirred to life, muted gold spilling over the rooftops, illuminating the apartment in fragile warmth. I hadn't moved, the journal still open, its words now etched into my memory. The sadness that had gripped me all night began to soften into something unexpected, compassion. I understood the weight he had carried, the grief he had never voiced, the life he had tried to reconcile with love that could never fully exist. I placed a hand over the journal, closing it gently, feeling its weight like a heartbeat, steady, enduring, and honest in ways he could never express aloud. He loved deeply, I whispered, my voice barely audible, trembling like a fragile leaf in the morning breeze. Maybe that's all any of us want, to love and be loved, even if the world never knows the whole story. Outside, a bird called, breaking the silence, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a quiet peace seep into my chest. I knew what I had to do next. I needed to face the past fully, to confront the living memory of someone who had shaped my husband's soul, and finally, my own. The streets were quiet, almost unnaturally so, as I drove through the neighborhood bathed in the soft gray of an early morning fog. The headlights glinted off the wet pavement, reflecting fragments of the past in every puddle, laughter, arguments, whispered confessions, forgotten promises. Each turn brought me closer to the house I had shared with him for 2 decades, a home that once pulsed with warmth, now standing like a silent monument to memories both cherished and painful. I parked my car, and for a long moment, I sat still, hands gripping the steering wheel, feeling the cold metal beneath my fingers, letting the weight of anticipation, fear, and sorrow press down on my chest. The front door, once a portal to comfort and familiarity, now seemed imposing, a threshold between the life I had known and the truth I had unearthed. As I reached for the brass handle, my fingers trembled, not from fear but from the fragile tension of unresolved emotions. The garden outside, trimmed and tidy, seemed almost mocking in its perfection, each flower a delicate reminder of a life we had cultivated together. A bird fluttered past the window, its wings catching the faint light, and I imagined it carrying whispers of the secrets I had just discovered. Inside, the house smelled of aged wood, dust, and faint traces of his cologne, lingering stubbornly like a ghost refusing to leave. Each step through the hallway echoed eerily, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting to see what I would do next. I placed the bouquet from the cemetery on the hall table, petals trembling slightly, and for a brief moment, I imagined him standing there, silent and watching, just as he had so many times before. The study, my old sanctuary, was dimly lit, sunlight filtering weakly through curtains dusted with the residue of forgotten years. The will sat on the desk like a stone, its presence both accusatory and final. Every word I had read in the lawyer's office, for my true love, replayed in my mind, echoing louder in the emptiness of the room. I ran my hands over the polished wood, tracing the grain as though it could guide me back to the man I had thought I knew. The envelopes were fragile now, their edges curling slightly with age, yet heavy with the weight of revelations and unanswered questions. Slowly, deliberately, I gathered them, stacking each one carefully, feeling the history, the secrets, and the emotions pressing into my fingers. I opened the drawer I had designated for keepsakes and memories, and placed the papers inside, one by one, as if putting away the final chapter of a book I had loved deeply but could never fully understand. The click of the lock reverberated like a punctuation mark on years of confusion, heartbreak, and silent suffering. I lingered in the room, letting my eyes travel over the furniture, the books lining the shelves, the faint fingerprints on the glass of picture frames, reminders of shared meals, arguments, laughter, and quiet tears. Outside, the wind shifted, tugging at the curtains and stirring the dust motes into a slow, ghostly dance. It was as if the house itself was acknowledging that something had ended here, and that a new chapter, fragile and tentative, could now begin. I moved to the window and pushed it open slowly, the metal hinge squealing softly, protesting against years of disuse. A rush of crisp, clean air poured into the room, carrying the faint scent of spring blooms and distant rain, brushing against my skin like a gentle reminder that life continues outside these walls. I rested my hands on the sill and leaned forward, letting the sounds of the city filter in, footsteps echoing in alleys, the soft hum of engines waking from slumber, a dog barking in the distance, ordinary life that somehow felt sacred after weeks of silence and grief. Sunlight caught on the leaves of the tree outside, scattering tiny golden sparks across the room, illuminating the shadows that had clung to my heart for so long. I closed my eyes and inhaled deeply, letting the breeze fill my lungs, carrying away months of anger, sorrow, and confusion. Memories of him, both tender and painful, passed through my mind, not as accusations, but as reminders of a love that had been imperfect, human, and ultimately, fleeting. I whispered to the empty room, softly, as if speaking to him, to the past, and to myself, I forgive. I release. I live. The words felt weighty, like stones dropping into a dark river, sinking slowly, leaving ripples of calm in their wake. The air seemed to shift, lighter now, the oppressive heaviness of grief lifting just enough for clarity and peace to settle in its place. I turned slowly, gazing around the house one last time, taking in every corner, every shadow, every trace of what had been. And in that moment, I smiled, not a smile of forgetting, nor of pain, but of completion, acceptance, and quiet triumph. The past would always be part of me, but it no longer ruled me. The house, the will, the secrets, all of it could rest now. Outside, the sun climbed higher, scattering the last remnants of dawn, and I felt, truly, that life awaited me again. A gentle breeze whispered through the open window, carrying with it a promise: endings are never final, and peace is earned, not given. They say forgiveness is easy when you forget, but a father never truly forgets. He remembers the mornings when the sun hadn't yet risen, the kitchen bathed in the pale glow of a single bulb, as he prepared breakfast with hands stiff from the cold and fatigue. Every slice of bread, every carefully measured portion, every cup of tea poured just so, it was all a small act of devotion, unnoticed by the world but burning brightly in his heart. He remembers the nights when silence filled the house, the only sound the soft ticking of a clock and the faint breathing of a child asleep, while he sat awake counting coins, stretching every dollar to keep the lights on and the heat running. He remembers scraped knees, fevers that burned late into the night, and whispered fears of a child who didn't yet understand the weight of life. He remembers the lonely decisions, the dreams deferred, the moments he swallowed his own desires to make room for another's happiness. And through it all, he never spoke of his sacrifices. They were quiet, invisible threads woven into the fabric of the family, binding them together without anyone ever noticing. Sometimes love is not loud. Sometimes it is a quiet endurance, a persistence in the face of neglect and misunderstanding. Sometimes, love is a ledger of small acts that accumulate into a lifetime, so heavy with meaning that words cannot capture its weight. And yet, there comes a moment when that love must be acknowledged, not for revenge, not for anger, but so that it is seen, understood, and respected. Silence can teach more than words ever could. The quiet, deliberate acts of a parent ripple through a life in ways children may never fully comprehend, until the moment they are reminded. He didn't want vengeance. He didn't want to shame or punish. He wanted remembrance, the kind that humbles hearts and makes people see the truth they had ignored. He wanted them to feel the cost of the life they were given, to understand the invisible labor that had kept them safe, fed, and clothed, long before they could grasp the world's complexity. It was not a lesson in cruelty but a revelation of reality, the truth that love, when unacknowledged, can quietly demand justice. Family is not built on blood alone. It is built on respect, on recognition of the sacrifices that others make for us, and on the humility to honor them. When respect fades, even the deepest love can feel like a house with a collapsing foundation. And he knew that some lessons must be carved into memory, not through anger, but through understanding. The bills were paid again, not just with money, but with intention, with care, with a slow insistence that the debt of pride, the hidden sacrifices, and the years of devotion were finally acknowledged. And with that, a profound calm settled over him, a peace that comes from seeing the truth realized, from knowing that he had done all he could to guide, protect, and teach, even when unseen. He could finally exhale, letting the weight of decades lift slowly from his shoulders, leaving room for quiet reflection and the faint, steady glow of pride. He walked through the house, pausing in the hallway where his son had once taken his first steps, where laughter had once echoed in corners now silent. Every photograph, every relic, every shadow held memory. And now, for the first time, he could see those memories not with bitterness, but with clarity. Not with anger, but with acknowledgement. Because in the end, life is measured not only by love but by the courage to make that love seen, felt, and remembered. And sometimes, the greatest act of love is ensuring that even when mistakes are made, even when pride blinds the hearts of the young, the truth of devotion is never lost. The lights remained steady, the air was calm, and for the first time in a long while, the house, and the man who had held it all together, was finally at peace.